It is my honor and pleasure to chair this first session of today, and my turn to thank all those who have been thanked already, and in particular Ilana, of course, and Liora, with whom we are constituting this research group that has already organized several conferences and has many big plans for the future. I just want to say now that the proceedings of this conference will be published, and I want to show you here briefly in what context. This is a series at the Gruyter in English called Perspectives on Jewish Texts and Contexts. And you can see that the first name on the editorial board is somebody present as well as others. But what I mainly want to show you is the books that have already come out on the one side and the books that are in the making on the other side. The first book was edited by Liora and Ilana, and I want to thank them for having produced such a wonderful volume. So here are the two books, the Book of Job and Lament in Jewish thought. So we are planning to have a book on Psalms, and I would like the contributors to this conference to know that we are expecting their papers very soon. Now I just want to introduce the first speakers. Jonathan Sheeham, who will speak about Psalms and the types of Christian sacrifice, and Yael Selah-Teichler on Moses Mendelssohn on Psalms, music and redemption between Jerusalem and Athens on the spree. Jonathan Sheeham is professor of early modern European history at the University of California, Berkeley. He is co-author with Dror Warman of Invisible Hands, Self-Organization and the 18th Century, and the Enlightenment Bible, Translation, Scholarship, Culture, which won the George Mossey Prize for the American Historical Association and was a Choice Outstanding Academic title. His recent articles have appeared in Representations, Proof Text, the Journal of the History of Ideas, and Past and Present. He's currently working on a project on sacrifice and theology in the early modern period. We have started a bit late, so we can be lenient with the timing, but we should keep an eye on the clock. So, Jonathan, thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thanks to the organizers for this. And I didn't realize this was the first conference at the Mendel School, and so it's particularly humbling to be here today. At the beginning, I thought that this talk might be slightly orthogonal to the main themes of this conference, and then we went to Mount Zion yesterday, and I realized that perhaps it wasn't. That if Mount Zion is about a place with the terms of the kind of things that bring together a group of people in one place, actually it ends up prying them apart. This talk is about ways in which shared histories pry apart Christian communities. So it's an exploratory talk. It's a bit more about sacrifice. Yeah, I have a few pictures just to keep, so you don't have to look at me all the time. You can look at something else. It's perhaps a bit more about sacrifice than about the Psalms, but its goal is to show how an ancient Christian practice of reading the Psalms and texts like them later on becomes a lever that pries apart Christian communions in the wake of the European Reformations. So I wanted to start with a perhaps unexpected place, some passages from the Roman canon of the Mass, and specifically from the section of the Mass that involves the consecration of the sacramental elements of the bread and the wine. It's a kind of sacred center to the Mass, to prepare the priest and the parishioners for the miracle of communion. And here the priest, with his back to the congregation traditionally, and whispering, first adores the elements and then offers them up to God the Father. We do offer up to your most excellent majesty of those own gifts that you gave to us, a pure victim, a holy victim, an immaculate victim, the holy bread of eternal life, and the chalice of everlasting salvation, upon which might you deign to look with propitious and serene face, and to accept them just as were accepted the gifts of your just servant Abel, and the sacrifice of our patriarch Abraham, and that which the high priest Melchizedek offered to you, a holy sacrifice, an immaculate victim. So this passage is taken from the missal formalized in the Council of Trent in 1570, and it's one that's remarkable for the series of exchanges that it imagines. The offering from the priest to the Father, of the Father's gift of the Son, namely the bread and the wine, which the priest hopes the Father will accept in return as a gift from the Christian community, just as he, the Father, accepted the gifts of the patriarchs, and which on acceptance will convey to the assembled Christians the benefits of those self-same gifts. Also remarkable is the presence of those patriarchs at all in the central liturgy of the Catholic Church. Abel, son of Adam, who pleased God with his offerings of the fat portions. Abraham, who pleased God with his near sacrifice of Isaac, and Melchizedek, priest of the God Most High, who blessed Abraham, and in one tradition of Christian interpretation was understood to offer bread and wine as oblations to God. Now, there's nothing particularly unusual about these typological associations. This is Mass, the original text of this Mass is very early, something like 7th century, I think. Gregorian sacramentary already starts to put these things together, this kind of conceptual universe together, and you can find images that bind the three patriarchs to Christian liturgy as early as the 6th century. Here in the San Vitale in Ravenna, this mosaic, you can see Melchizedek there, Abel over on the side there making the offerings of the Eucharist, or again in the 7th century, and I hope that this is going to work. Yeah. At the Basilica of Santa Apollinare in Classe, also in Ravenna, and in this case I think that Melchizedek's there in the middle figure, and such idealizations are still very much active in the 16th century. You can see here a panel from a Dutch altarpiece in which Melchizedek there is receiving offering out of the gifts of bread and wine. And that's Abraham there kneeling. So in a general sense, this is from 1510. In a general sense, this is part of this creative project, as I see it, of religious, literary, and cultural translation, as the contents of what would become the Old Testament are folded into Christianity. Now, this is common knowledge, especially in a group like this. Perhaps less well known is what happened in the 16th century and afterwards, when that complex network of sacrificial exchanges that you see in the canon of the Mass is subjected to the pressures of intra-Christian conflict. Typology translated Jewish text and tradition into a Christian language, but what happened when the terms of that translation, that is the equivalences between sacrifices old and new, itself becomes an occasion for dispute. And for the rest of this talk, I want to explore this question, with particular, though not exclusive, focus on the Psalms as a site of typological transformation. So I want to step back before I step forward once more, and just look, you can already see something of the complexity of Christian sacrifice in the New Testament, already say in 1 Corinthians. And here I'm going to read you a little bit from Paul in the King James Version. I won't be reading Maurice's translation, but I'll be reading the King James Version, at least the version closest to what my early moderns would have known. The cup of blessing, Paul said, which we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. What pagans offer, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be partners with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. So Paul's careful to note that there are two cups and two breads. There's a cup that we bless and one that we reject. There's a cup for the demons and there's one for the Lord. A cup that's empty, that's nothing, he'll call it at various points, and a cup that pours out the redemptive blood of Christ. Paul has to be careful, doubtless, because the two cups look so similar. So alike, in fact, that the Corinthians are quarreling about how exactly to distinguish between the things that are properly Christian and the things which are of Israel or of Rome. Each of you says, quote, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ, is how Paul characterizes the conflict. And it's worth, I think, mooting a counterfactual here, that given the difficulty of the Corinthians, signaled by the Corinthians, given the difficulty of distinguishing that's signaled by the Corinthians' confusion, why didn't Paul and early Christians more generally just abandon everything that smacked of Jerusalem and Rome, not to speak of Athens? Why not no cup, no bread, no blood, no altar, rather than these difficult translations or integrations? And obviously there are many, many reasons why this path wasn't chosen, and I just want to isolate one of the factors that discouraged the radical innovation suggested in the counterfactual, namely the hope that's evident already in Paul that by conserving some kind of archive, a linguistic, liturgical, or imaginative archive, Christianity might fold its competitors into itself. It was a gamble on absorption rather than rejection, and one that relied on complex translational practices to put something ostensibly foreign to work for itself. Now I say ostensibly foreign deliberately because in large part it was the very process of absorption that identified what things would count as alien to Christianity and what things not. And you can see this already in Paul, where the two cups, which are so similar and so different, mark the distinction between true and demonic worship. So the more successful the absorption, in other words, the more the materials from the older tradition come to mark exactly its supersession by the new, which makes me realize why the man at Mount Zion yesterday was so insistent that this was a place that didn't belong to Christians at all, because he's recognizing still 2,000 years later the ways in which there's this absorption is precisely a site of contest and argument. So typology is already an absorptive technique in the New Testament. The many possible examples, you can point out the recycling of Psalms in that most absorptive of New Testament letters, the Epistle to the Hebrews, and in the middle of that work, the author begins to translate the institutions of Israel into a new Christian theological idiom. Quote, Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, unquote, but rather was appointed by God, who told him, speaking the language of Psalm 110, quote, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Later in the letter, the author puts the language of Psalm 40 in the mouth of Christ. Quote, sacrifices and offerings thou hast not desired, but a body hast thou prepared for me. Letting the author then comment that Christ, quote, abolishes the first in order to establish the second, offerings abolished by the offerings of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. Typology does not, needless to say, set Old and New Testaments into relations of equality. Rather, the old is absorbed into the body of the new, abolished, and given the status of a thing left behind once and for all. And the word is ephipox in Greek, and luckily there's people who've written whole treatises on this one word, ephipox. So if anyone's interested in this once and for all, it's a fantastically important word for this moment of typological abolition. So at the same time, though, this Old Testament, or this stuff that's been transformed, is also preserved as a generative deposit in the Christian archive, something that can and will be called upon to do a theological and liturgical work. So it's typology and typological reason that will move the figure of Melchizedek, say, along the spindle of the Old Testament from Genesis to it's one of the great staging grounds of typological transformation to the Psalms, to the Son of David, as he's often called, Jesus Christ, and then make possible the identifications of Christ in this enigmatic ancient priest-king in the Roman liturgy above. And it's also typology that helped make the status of Christian sacrifice so productively ambivalent. Christ, quote, enters once for all, ephipox, into the holy place, taking not the blood of goats and calves, but his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption, the Hebrew author writes, letting us see Christ as abolition, repetition, extension, and perfection of the sacrifices found in Israel. No wonder that sacrifice will come to play such an important role in the theological and liturgical life of Christianity, even as Christians insisted that they, in their view uniquely among the religions of the ancient world, were not the sacrificing sort at all. So that's all I want to say about the early church. And instead I want to move on quickly now to the world of religious division that's inaugurated by the Reformation. And I want to start to look at that period by looking at a commentary that emerges at the end of that age. The commentator is the great Lutheran spiritualist of the early 17th century, a man named Johann Arndt, and the text, the prophetic, as the Christians would have labeled it, the prophetic, Psalm 110. Now, Arndt loved the Psalms. The commentary is 1,500 pages of closely printed text with multiple sermons on every passage of every psalm. And his commentary on Psalm 110 has an extensive investigation of the Melchizedek typology that turns on the hypothetical that he asks, why not Aaron? Why isn't Aaron the type for Christ? And Arndt then gives an exhaustive answer. Aaron was only a priest and not a king. Aaron only wore earthly garb. You can hear a contrast in each of these. Aaron sacrificed calves and oxen. He sprinkled the people with blood. He had to sacrifice for his own sins and so on. Whereas Melchizedek was, like Christ, both king and priest. His bread and wine refreshed Israel the way that Christ refreshes all mankind. Abraham recognized him as a king. No one knows when Melchizedek's rule ended. The fact that he never appears again was taken by Christians then to refer to the eternality of Melchizedek's rule, and so on. Now, it's interesting that Arndt ceases the typologizing when he gets to the sacrificial role of the high priest. That is, the Melchizedek type works to unfold Christ's role as a high priest until precisely the point that this high priesthood takes on something like a sacrificial caste, and then Arndt just stops the story. But this seems kind of odd. If the type was useful and had been useful, as we saw already in the Missal, the canon of the Mass, if the type was useful to explain Christ's kingship, his eternality, his refreshing spirit, why not his sacrifice as well? Now, to understand then why Arndt is nervous about that particular moment of the type, and to show how perplexing Christian sacrifice had become by the early 17th century, I want to go back now to some of the sort of Reformation, kind of crystallizations of Reformation conflict, and specifically a quote. There's lots and lots of this stuff, but a little quote from John Calvin where he addresses head-on the curious fact that Christians do and don't sacrifice at the same time. So he writes, how can we reconcile the two things? That Jesus Christ in dying offered a sacrifice to his Father by which he has once for all, which is an Epiphax quote there, purchased forgiveness and pardon for all of our faults, on the one hand, and that it is every day necessary, on the other hand, to sacrifice in order to obtain that which we ought to seek in his death only. And that second part is what the Catholics do, basically. This latter error, he goes on, was not so first extreme, this desire to sacrifice again and again, but increased little by little until it came to be what it now is. And it appears, he says, that the ancient fathers called the supper, the fact that the room of the Last Supper is there and Mount Zion was very pleasing to me yesterday, called the supper a sacrifice, but the reason they give is because the death of Christ is represented in it. And so, hence their view comes to this, that this name is given to it merely because it's a memorial of the one sacrifice. And yet, he goes on, I can't excuse the custom of the early church. By gestures and modes of acting, they figured a species of sacrifice, with a ceremony resembling that which existed under the Old Testament, excepting that instead of a beast, they used bread as the host. And as that approaches too near to Judaism and does not correspond to our Lord's institution, I approve it not. So this was 1540, when he wrote his short treatise on the Low Supper of the Lord, and it had by that point it had already become a commonplace among Protestant reformers that the sacrifice of the Mass, that a liturgical reenactment of Christ's sacrifice was a kind of abomination. In 1520, Luther, in his Babylonish captivity of the church, had declared the most wicked abuse of all the common belief that the Mass is a sacrifice. And he singled out, in particular for abuse, that canon of the Mass, as I start reading to you below, and the parallelism that it made between the sacrifices of Christ and Abel, Melchizedek, and Abraham. Luther's and Calvin's clarity of vision was complicated, both admitted, by the history of Christianity itself, not least its history of typological translation. Quote, what shall we say then of the canon of the Mass and the patristic authorities, unquote, who speak in the same breath of sacrifice in the Mass? Luther asked and answered that they must have been talking about a different kind of sacrifice, one referring quote, not to the sacrament and testament, but to the collections, the food and the drink, gathered for the party after the Mass, or perhaps for the poor. By the time Calvin wrote, and in fact, in his translation of the Bible, Luther wanted to make sure in this little comment on the side that when Melchizedek is offering bread and wine, it's a kind of refreshing snack to Abraham and not an offering in the more significant sense. So by the time Calvin wrote, we can see the critique sharpen. The ancient fathers called the Eucharist the sacrifice he acknowledged, and as a result, the Church very early began to imagine that the communion was a sacrificial rite modeled on the Old Testament, with the host serving as a proxy for the animal victim. Too close to Judaism, he declared, implicitly criticizing not just the practices of the earliest Church, but the very method of Christian typology that had brought the Old and New Testaments into unity. Now, Catholics were quick to notice this. Already in the Council of Trent, the clerics are going to reach back to Psalm 110 and to defend the typological connection of Melchizedek and Christ, and by that the canon of the Mass. Their sketchy thoughts will be given a kind of concrete form in the 1580s by the Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, who's like the hammer of the Counter-Reformation Church, who vigorously defended the sacrificial Mass. He writes, thus, if Christ is a priest after the order of Melchizedek and not of Aaron, he must have instituted a bloodless sacrifice, and under the appearance of bread and wine, Melchizedek offered bread and wine as a priest of the highest God, and for that reason he sacrificed truly. Thus Christ, in his institution of the Eucharist, acted as a priest and sacrificed truly. Otherwise he would not have fulfilled the figure exactly. And there's something interesting going on, and I won't talk about it here, about the status of typology, and whether typology is understood just as a hermeneutic technique, or as something which is inherent somehow in the actual construction of the Bible itself from the get-go. It must be observed, Bellarmine continues, that seen correctly, Christ was not a priest after the order of Melchizedek by reason of the sacrifice on the cross, because that was a bloody sacrifice, but only by reason of the sacrifice of the Eucharist. So already in Bellarmine and the Tridentine scholars, Catholic scholars, you can see how the pressures of Reformation critique, that is the focus on the terms of the translation of between Old and New Testaments, forces a great deal of creativity and attention to these mechanics that link them. Bellarmine's insistence that bloodlessness was a crucial tie that bound Christ and Melchizedek was a considerable innovation, and actually maybe perhaps a perilous one, since it was bloody sacrifice that had linked Christ to other members of that canon, including Abel. Reformers, for their part, had to be even more creative, or at least as creative as their Catholic opponents, if they wanted to salvage the translational bridges between Old and New dispensations. And just for brevity, I'll focus a little bit on Calvin, again, who took up the Melchizedek type directly in his 1560 Institutes of the Christian Religion. First, he attacked what he saw as Catholic translational liberties with the figure, to say that because the priest-king offered bread and wine, there is, quote, a likeness between him and Christ, is, quote, he's too flimsy and foolish to need refutation, and for his part, Calvin will realign the figural relationship no longer with the sacrifice of Melchizedek served to bridge Old and New. Rather, it's the priesthood of Melchizedek that mattered. When, quote, Scripture introduced him as the priest of the living God, it never afterwards mentions him, implying his life had been without end, and from this similarity, Christ is called priest according to his order. Now, so typology is a flexible tool, and so these guys are playing with its possibilities, but however flexible it might have been, Calvin is still struggling with a history of interpretation. No less an authority for him than the beloved Augustine had insisted, again referring to Psalms 110 and its translation through Hebrews 7, that the, quote, first appearance of that sacrifice, which is now offered to God by Christians all over the world, that is the Eucharist, could be found in the bread and wine of Melchizedek. Put another way, the absorptive practices of early Christianity, so crucial to the very institution and building of the church, it became a kind of irritant, too close to Judaism, was the concern that Calvin registered above. The presence of the Old Testament, however translated into a Christian idiom, meant that what had been an advantage to Christianity, or it seemed like such, now seemed to be, in the context of Reformation conflict, a kind of liability. The difficulty that Calvin and other reformers faced was, in other words, the heterogeneity of their own tradition, or Put it another way, how to manage the consequences of Christianity's success in translating Judaism, or paganism for that matter, into its own idiom. The critique of the Mass as too Jewish or too pagan thus unleashed a torrent of creativity about things sacrificial, as Protestants and Catholics too sought to understand what exactly sacrifice was. In fact, this concern is something which is Reformers are onto, Catholics are onto, even very earliest of the sort of reforming Catholics are onto this. So the criticisms of the Mass and the violence unleashed in the first years of the Reformation pushed scholars like Erasmus into the Christian archives to discover what exactly sacrifice was. In another commentary on the Psalms, Erasmus's De Sarcienda Ecclesiae Concordia, which is published in 1533, and it's a commentary on what Christians would call the Thanksgiving, most people call the Thanksgiving Psalm, 84. He spoke of a long history of translated rituals. First, the translation of pagan ritual by Moses, and later the translation of Jewish ritual by the Christian. Quote, as for the word sacrifice or immolation, the doctors of the church in former times expressed no horror. Oh, I'm supposed to, okay. I thought I had 25 minutes. Is that already at 25 minutes? Okay. Christ, having died once, dies no more. I agree, but that one sacrifice is, as it were, daily renewed in mystic rites as we continue to draw fresh grapes from that perennial spring. I'm going to scoot a little bit through Erasmus. Protestants, too, would look to remake sacrifice into something that could be both excluded from the Mass and included somewhere else in liturgy and theology. And here again, I might just say, you might ask, well, why, if sacrifice is such a Jewish or pagan thing for these reformers, didn't they also, in my kind of counterfactual move that I had with Paul, just say, okay, no sacrifice. Why don't we just get rid of it altogether? Let's just imagine a Christianity without sacrifice at all. And the problem for the reformers was that there were actual people, who did argue that we should have no sacrifice at all. It's just that for the reformers, these guys were heretics. These would have been Anabaptists or Socinians, a whole variety of heretical Christian traditions that decided, let's just get rid of, more or less, the Eucharist, and the Eucharist altogether, in the same way there were ancient heretical Eucharists that got rid of the bread and the wine in the ancient period. So I have to scoot kind of quickly through but I wanted you to see how the Protestants are sort of hemmed in here between, on the one hand, a commitment to an older typological tradition, and on the other hand, a temptation to get rid of sacrifice altogether, which some people went ahead and did. But these guys, in order to maintain something like Christian orthodoxy, need to hold on to typology and the sort of sacrificial translation, but in some new form. So since I've been asked to wind down, I'll just bring us back quickly to Johann Arndt's 1617 Psalm commentary, because this history that I just told you helps me to understand his approach to Melchizedek and sacrifice. So when he aligns Christ and Melchizedek to answer the question, what is a high priest, but then drops the patriarch at exactly the moment that sacrifice comes into the picture, Arndt responded in a creative textual way to the challenges of sacrifice above. That is, he just decided, okay, well, let's just pretend like there is no possible typological alignment between these two sort of elements. That is, the figure that links Christ and Melchizedek does not include a sacrificial element, which would allow you then, in his view, just by sort of pretending that it didn't exist, to hold on to, and he'll go on to argue that there is proper Christian sacrifice. It's just that now, in his view, this is something we can think of without reference to the Melchizedekian or the Old Testament tradition. That is, he's trying to imagine, in a sense, a sacrificial Christianity without the inherited burden of the Old Testament. So just to conclude, in his magnificent book, Christianity and the West, the medieval historian John Bossy remarked on what he saw as the great irony in the Reformation period, namely that the Eucharist, the one institution that should have held Christians together, in fact blew apart the unity of the Latin Christian West. Now, as far as it goes, I would agree with this assessment, but I would only add that this should have come as no surprise. The Eucharist may have played a role in cementing and unifying Christian society, but only because for a certain amount of time, Christians imagined that they collectively knew what the Eucharist was. Once they noticed just how complex and heterogeneous this thing was, once they noticed, in fact, just how complex and heterogeneous was the whole thing that they knew as Christianity, it became a near inevitability that the very symbols of unity should become the sources of fiercest dissension. Thanks.
explaining this wonderful paradox that he just presented to us of the symbol of unification being the source of divergence and controversies.
Oh, I have a question. That's right. I'm taking questions.
Yes.
Pardon. Yeah, so,
Yes, questions.
Thank you very much. My question is, to what extent was the, I mean, if that, from what I understood, that there was a problem with the typology and a problem with the sort of Jewish impact. So, to what extent was the anti-Jewish element pronounced, and how much was it in the fore or just in the background while the main arguments were about the typology and so forth?
I think it was more or less in the back. It was in the back. I mean, look, there's a strong anti-Jewish element that you can trace through, particularly people like Luther, that can be foregrounded very powerfully in certain texts. But in terms of these sorts of debates,
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
the issue is it's an opportunistic problem. That is that it's okay to be Jewish in certain sorts of ways and just not in other sorts of ways. That is, the Jews sort of emerge into the problem of the assimilation of an Old Testament tradition into the Christian types, as Arndt shows you, works perfectly fine. He's very happy to do all sorts of moments of absorption, just so long as the absorption doesn't reach that kind of critical sensitive center that he's concerned to protect. That is the uniqueness, the once for all of Christ's death. So that the anti-Judaism kind of comes and goes in rather opportunistic ways in these sorts of texts, and there'll be plenty of other people for whom the discovery, and Protestants just as well as Catholics, the discovery of a Jewish precedent to a Christian rite will be seen as a source of authority, not as a source of problem for the tradition. So it's making the map of when and where Judaism becomes a problem is one of the goals of a project like this. But it's certainly not. It's not a comprehensive problem that it's seen now as kind of the challenge of Judaism. I think that's something that happens only much later on, where Judaism becomes more, in the Old Testament, more generally becomes a kind of threat to the integrity of what is Christianity. And by that time, typology basically has completely fallen out of favor as an interpretive strategy altogether. And that's sort of the 18th century story.
I think there was another question.
I have a question, but sort of not very properly formulated.
Then try to condense it.
Yes, yes. Okay. So, if I think of a sort of proto-Protestant reformer such as the 14th century Englishman John Wycliffe, for him, opposing papal authority, claiming that secular authority should take a more active role in governing church affairs, was into conflict with the Pope, but did not really lead into full-blown heresy or full-blown ostracism. But once he denied the miracle of the transubstantiation, he was expelled from Oxford and died several years later. So I'm thinking of a more active part taken by Protestant reformers in order to oppose papal authority by sort of targeting the main sort of mystery performed by the Catholic Church. So instead of, let's say, divergent understandings being translated into opposing political factions, I would rather reverse this process and say opposing political factions take different attitudes to the Eucharist as part of their power struggles.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's. I don't know why we need to sort of to choose. I mean, it seems like one can, like for example, Luther. Luther is a trimmer. I would, in terms of the question of what actually is happening in those elements there, and he's quite. That is, he doesn't go right after transubstantiation as the main problem. He gets kind of pulled that direction by more radical people like Karlstadt, more radical reformers who sort of unilaterally decide that the Mass is, it's got to be reform from the inside out, that is from the elements out. And he will, for his whole life, try to hold on to some sort of middle ground between, you know, a fully figural Eucharist and you know, and a fully corporeal kind of transubstantial. So it's not clear to me that we need to make a decision. That first, the goal was, I mean, that would assume that the goal is first to pull apart from Rome, and then to get what are the tools that we use for that? Well, let's go after the Eucharist. When you look at the internal history of the reformers, the decision of when it is that they want to pull apart from Rome, it seems to happen rather late. There's a great deal of effort to try to pull these two things back together. And oftentimes, they know that the Eucharist is the thing that kind of splits them apart. And so there's all sorts of, you know, like even as late as the 1540s, people are trying to figure out some kind of conciliatory language that would be able to get all of us on board. So I think that there's certain people who see this as the sort of soft spot, the sort of Roman soft spot. If we go after that, we can kind of schism. And there's other people who are not interested in blowing apart the whole Latin Christian West, who want to hold on to some sort of middle ground version of these, even among the reformers. So I'm not sure. I hope that's some distance.
Thank you.
Oh.